Pray with me. O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, our rock and redeemer. Amen. I really wish we had a voice recording of Jesus telling this parable and reflecting on it, because I'm curious to know if he's being sarcastic or ironic in this telling. Because if we knew that, then a lot of our discomfort with this parable would just go away. And truth be told, I was going a totally different direction with this sermon until yesterday morning. I confess I was more or less trying to make this parable go away by focusing on kind of the moral maxims that Jesus says afterward, because it's easier to preach on those who are faithful with very little are also faithful with much. It's easier to preach on that than on this confusing story of a conniving, rascally manager. But try as I might, that sermon just would not come together, and this rascally manager just would not leave me alone. So with the help of a book from Eugene Peterson, his book, Tell It Slant, I gave it another look, and I think I've got it. So here's what I realized. Jesus was ahead of his time when he told this story. In this parable, Jesus may have established both the anti-hero and lovable con man genre we know today. This parable is not a morality tale. This is Breaking Bad. This is Mad Men. This is not Star Wars or Marvel with clear-cut heroes and villains. This is Ocean's 11. This is American Hustle. So how many of you have seen Ocean's 11? Did you like it? This is a little older one, but shout out to Robert Redford, rest in peace. Have you seen The Sting? Did you like it? Having heard this parable again this morning, do you like this parable? Okay, I'm going to argue and prove my point that if you said yes to the first two and not the third, that makes no sense. That makes no sense. Because some of the same tropes happening in this parable are playing out in those beloved movies. So think about Ocean's 11. George Clooney's character, Danny Ocean, is not a good dude. Their Mark, Andy Garcia, the owner of the casino, whatever his character's name is, not a good dude. Brad Pitt, Lionel, not a good dude. Even though he's objectively handsome and charming, not a good dude. And yet we root for these bad guys. We want them to succeed in their theft of money that is not theirs. We don't know how they're going to do it, and their plan seems to be falling apart. But in the end, they pull it off. They trick Andy Garcia, whatever his name is, and we all applaud. And that story satisfies us. And somehow Mad Men and Breaking Bad are compelling or satisfying stories, even if they are tragic and morally backward. So why does this parable with this anti-hero and con man irk us so much? It's probably because Jesus tells it. And we have maybe foisted some expectations on Jesus. Maybe we expect only melodrama or moral lessons or happy endings from Jesus. Maybe it's irksome because Jesus seems to be recommending that this kind of behavior from his followers. Come on, Jesus, you can't mean that. Maybe it's irksome because we look at parables and we want everything to correlate with God. We think the master's God and the manager's us, and how do these spiritual things align? But a parable is an analogy. I think another reason it irks us is because Jesus tells this story right after one of our most beloved parables, the prodigal son. We have a kind of narrative arc whiplash, going from that compassionate father to this conniving self-interest and deceit by this rascally manager. And we're like, wait, what? I think Jesus was ahead of his time. I think he innovates the lovable anti-hero / con man genre in this story. And if we encounter this story on those terms, then we can glean some truth from it. And I'll pause here to say, no, Jesus is not recommending that his followers take a cue from Don Draper or Danny Ocean or Walter White. No, Jesus is not recommending that we behave exactly like the dishonest manager. And I don't mean to string you on, but I can't quite yet tell you what I think Jesus is doing. But please stick with me, play the game with me for a little bit longer. Because if you remember those films I mentioned, Ocean's 11, The Sting, American Hustle, they all play with the audience for a good portion of the film. We know the players in those films are con men. We know they are scheming to deceive their mark, but we don't quite know how. And several times it looks like their plan is unraveling and they will be caught. But in the end, we realize that they were playing the game in 5 dimensions the whole time. They make their score, they outwit their mark, oftentimes by playing on the personality flaws of their mark. And I don't know about you, but I would never be a good con man. I can barely see the game at all. And I certainly cannot see the game in the way that these characters or con men can. A good con man can read people, spot their vulnerabilities, and play to them. I don't have that skill, and I hope, being your pastor, that makes you happy. A good con man thinks through all the potential moves given the players and factors. A good con man always plans for an exit or two if the plan goes sideways. A good con man fosters relationships to outlast the current score. And a good con man works creatively in a crisis. A good con man knows that the system is whack. And a good con man plays the system against itself. And the truth is, we love a con man that deceitfully outwits a system that is itself deceitful and unjust. That is the heart of the anti-hero or con man genre. So with all that as background, allow me to retell this parable from the OG anti-hero storyteller, Jesus H. Christ. There was a man of great wealth. He owned many parcels of land and had many tenant farmers who rented land from him. He had several managers who dealt with the day-to-day debts of the tenant farmers for him. This allowed the landowner to stay out of the sticky business affairs with the farmers. And one day, the rich landowner learned from one of his managers that one of his managers was squandering his property and rent income. So the rich man called for him, fired him on the spot, and demanded that all his accounts would be audited in order to detail the scale of his theft. Rather than make excuses or beg for mercy, the manager begins to think of how he would survive. Jobless already and likely headed to prison in a matter of hours, he is in crisis mode and considers his options. Too spoiled from his lavish lifestyle, manual labor is out. Too proud from his privileged position, he was too ashamed to beg. And then it hits him. Up against the wall with limited options and limited time, he formulates an exit strategy to secure his survival. And like all good con man films, we can't see or understand the whole plan, but he sets to work. With mere hours before his inquisition before his boss, he contacts each tenant farmer about their debt to the landowner. And the tenant farmers assume that the manager is acting on the wishes of the landowner. I mean, how could he do anything else? And one by one, the manager slashes the debt they owe 20, 40, even 50%. Relieved of some of their debt burden, they thank the manager and they invite him to dine with them. And likewise, the farmers are grateful for their landowner's benevolence. And finally, the manager returns for his audit with the landowner, and glancing at the books, the landowner can see fresh ink on the parchment. There are obvious alterations to the books, slashing the debts of the tenant farmers, and the landowner knows that the manager has been scheming, and he realizes he will be getting less income. And though the older markings of the books are faded, the manager's prolonged mismanagement is still obvious to the landowner. So the landowner has been twice deceived and twice cheated of his money. And looking up from the books, and the landowner locks eyes with the manager, and in his mind, the landowner plays out two scenarios. One, he can jail the manager and then get involved in the mess of contacting all the tenant farmers, work usually delegated to his managers and underlings. And then he can tell the farmers this was a huge mistake, demand their debts be restored to the original amounts in order to get what he is due, and in so doing destroy his new reputation as a benevolent landowner, thus turning his presently grateful tenants into a simmering peasant uprising. Or choosing the obvious second option, the landowner smiles at the manager, closes his account book, and says, "My compliments." As the kids say, game, respect game. You are free to go. The landowner commends the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. And we, the audience, can now see how the manager knew the system and played the system in order to secure his survival. The manager is the rascal and a con man. The manager is a street smart survivor. The manager plays his mark like a fiddle, and the manager is the anti-hero we can't help rooting for. Damn, Jesus, it's a damn good story. And here is the important distinction for us in this anti-hero con man genre. Jesus is not recommending that we act like the dishonest manager. Don't be Danny Ocean. Don't be Don Draper. Please don't, for the love of God, be Walter White. But you may protest if you read verses 8 and 9. It sounds like Jesus is kind of saying we should emulate the dishonest manager. And this is where it gets confusing. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. Even more confusing, Jesus says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. And this is where I wish I could hear the tone in Jesus' voice. Is he being ironic? Is he being sarcastic? Is this satire? Because based on all his preceding parables and teachings, based on how he generously welcomes the poor and chides the hypocrisy of those in power, he can't be saying to emulate this rascal. So what is he doing? How are we supposed to live as a result of this parable? In his book, which helped me make it through this sermon, Eugene Peterson tells a story of how this parable became clear to him. He tells this story. After circling many times looking for a parking spot in Baltimore, he finally succumbed to the practice of his friends and prayed for a parking spot. And lo and behold, just then, a spot opened up. He parked, and with a dopey grin, he proceeded to his pastoral care visit. And after his visit, buoyed from his obvious encounter with the holy God of parking management, he was looking forward to telling his colleagues and friends that this kind of a prayer actually works. Upon arrival at his car later that day, he peeked in the car and saw his keys dangling from the ignition and the doors locked. His pious grin melted, and he stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at his keys at a loss for what to do. And just then, a 10-year-old boy, clearly familiar with the streets, walked up to him and said, "What's wrong, mister?" And upon telling the boy his predicament, the boy offered to help. And the boy pulled a piece of wire out of his pocket, and in under 30 seconds, he unlocked the car door. And after the boy handed him his keys, Eugene Peterson says to him, "I'm sure glad I was here when you showed up." And the boy smiled and said, "Is it worth $1 to you?" And reaching for his wallet, Eugene said, $1? It's worth $2. And after handing him the money, driving away and reflecting on the encounter, Peterson was struck by the contrast in his pious prayers and his subsequent crumbling when his keys were locked in the car, contrasting that with the hard-scrabble, street-smart survival of this 10-year-old boy. Similar to the interaction of the landowner and the manager in the parable, Peterson reflected on his landowner-esque praise for the young boy. A boy whose motives and knowledge of picking car doors might be suspect, but who nonetheless is eking out survival for himself in a bare-bones environment. This young boy is creative and scrappy given his limitations, even if his expertise is questionable. And returning to the parable, the manager is praised because he creates opportunity for survival when his options are limited. The manager is shrewd because he knows the system and he plays the system and the players against itself. Even if his actions are ethically suspect, his creativity within limits cannot be denied. So what is Jesus recommending? How are we supposed to live as a result of this parable? Perhaps sometimes we children of light, as Jesus calls us, can be a little too pious, when we need to be a bit scrappier and creative within the limits of this crooked system. That's not to say that we become the anti-hero or the con man, but we do ourselves and our neighbors a disservice if we think that the system is going to be fair. The system is not and never will be fair. Just read the news if you need proof. So what are we to do? Do we lay down and die? Do we merely follow our own self-interest? Do we beg the system for mercy or make excuses? Like the rascally manager, the scrappy 10-year-old boy, how can we be both faithful and shrewdly creative to make the good news real within our limits and within a crooked system? That is the question that the parable wants us to chew on, consider, and take action on. And I've toyed with you enough, like all those con men. So I'll say outright what I think Jesus is recommending with this parable. Kind of like a con man, kind of like an anti-hero, kind of like a dishonest manager. Understand and know what system you are operating in, so that as you faithfully and shrewdly work to guard yourself and save others from it, you do not become a perpetrator or a victim of it. Be like the rascal to the extent that you know the system is out of whack. Be like the rascal to the extent that you creatively play on the frailty and limitations of the system. But unlike the rascal, put on the faithfulness of Christ in order to effect and create goodness, not just for yourself, but for all people. Unlike the rascal, fight against the conniving self-interest and love of wealth. Unlike the rascal, remain faithful to love your neighbor and love God. Therein lies the distinction, as Jesus clearly says, You cannot serve God and wealth. Because greed is at the heart of the American system, my friends. Greed and self-interest are powerful motivators, almost always leading to harm, especially when coupled with privilege. And we ignore that fact at our peril and the peril of others. If we want to spare people from the harm at the hands of this greedy system, we need to know what motivates the system. But hear me, we do not need to be lured into big plans and schemes either. Because remember those words of Jesus. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. With little and with much. These words have echoed for me this week. These words remind me of my old boss at Covenant Point Bible Camp, Chuck Frazier. Chuck often described his philosophy this way: if you worry about and care for the little things, the big things take care of themselves. Chuck would get on you if you left the lights on or the fridge door open, but when the power went out or the fridge just up and died, Chuck took it in stride. You would get an earful if you failed to fill the chainsaw with bar oil, but when we had to use that same chainsaw and came and told him that a giant tree had fallen onto the roof of the tabernacle, crushing the roof, Chuck laughed and said, "Oh, that big poplar, I've been keeping an eye on that." People earned Chuck's trust not by big acts or scheming to get it. It was little moments. Like when he saw me taking extra care to scrub out the food waste in the grates of the Hobart dishwasher. If people proved faithful with the little things, they were entrusted with much. If people cared for the little things, Chuck trusted that the big things would care for themselves, not because he was indifferent to the big things. He was actually quite vigilant. But because the habit of concern and therefore the precise knowledge of the little things meant that when there was a crisis, we could understand the problem and we could come up with creative solutions. Which crisis are we called to address, ResCov? What are the little things we have cared for that have seasoned us to care for much? How can we faithfully and shrewdly make the good news real for our neighbor? My friends, we are not called to be heroes or anti-heroes. We are not called to be patsies or con men. We are called to be faithful to the inexhaustibly creative and resurrected Christ. That scrappy little storyteller of little puzzling stories, whose little stories have created so much to consider and reconsider, little stories with very little detail, but they have produced so much. May this little story provoke us to live out little scrappy acts of faith. Little acts that by God's power become the much more our neighbors actually need. Amen.